Welcome to the final chapter of this course. As I said from the beginning, this guide is a manual to help you learn where everything in the panel is and how it works. Anytime you're wondering what a feature is, you should be able to go back and find it in the corresponding chapter to get a quick refresher. But in the same way that you aren't going to learn how to drive by reading your car's user manual, you also aren't going to learn to drive the panel just by knowing what all the buttons do. If you're a seasoned TK Actions user, then incorporating the TK7 panel into your workflow should be easy. But if you're new to TK Actions, then just like driving, it's going to take some time and some practice. In this final chapter, I'm going to demonstrate a brief image workflow on one of my images so you can see how I drive the panel. My YouTube channel and my complete workflow video courses are a good place to get even more insight into how I use the panel as part of my workflow. In time, I will also produce new videos that feature the TK7 panel, but there's a lot to be learned from the tutorials that feature older versions of the panel as well. Okay, so I'm going to go over to Lightroom because I want to begin developing this image from the original raw file. Tony and I both prefer more of a free-form developing approach where the image determines what the next step is, instead of some predetermined formula that uses the same steps every time. If I know that I'll be going on to develop the image in Photoshop, I don't try to create a finished image here in Lightroom. That only leads to overcooking the image with additional adjustments later in Photoshop. Instead, I just make some basic adjustments for white balance and maybe a little bit of exposure control. For example, maybe bringing up the exposure slightly, bringing down the highlights so I don't lose my highlight color and information. Maybe bring up the blacks slightly so I'm not clipping the blacks. And then I'd probably do some lens correction, such as removing chromatic aberration. I might do lens profile correction, but in this case, I think that distorts the C-stacks even more, so I'm not going to use that on this image. I'll do transformations to the image if I think I can do them best here in Lightroom. For example, this image is tilted a bit, so I would rotate it to get the horizon back here level. I'll constrain the crop so I don't see those white edges. And I might also do a little bit of vertical transformation to compensate for the fact that my lens was pointed down and it's kind of stretching that C-stack in the upper left in a weird way. Also at this point, I'll do any spot removal using the spot removal tool just to get rid of those early in the process if I remember. Sometimes I forget. Then I edit in Photoshop. I might open it as a smart object in Photoshop if I think I want to come back and have the ability to readjust these raw adjustments that I've done. But if I don't think so, I'll just go ahead and open it or edit it right in Photoshop as a regular image file. My first step in Photoshop is to make sure that there are not any additional cleanup jobs such as residual chromatic aberration, dust spots I missed, or anything else that I want to do in terms of cloning or altering the pixels of the image. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in to 100% just to take a look here. It looks like Lightroom did a good job of removing chromatic aberration on these kind of high contrast edges, so I'm not too worried about that. I can also, if I want to, run the plus minus dust action just to take one more look and make sure that I didn't miss any dust spots, and I did. There's one right there, so I'll go ahead and remove that. And let's see, anything else? Don't see anything up in the sky, and the water looks pretty good. No, actually that might be a dust spot there. Maybe not, whatever it is. Took care of it. Everything else looks good. Okay, so now I can click plus minus dust again. And now I feel pretty confident that I've gotten all the dust spots, and I don't want those dust spots back, so I'll go ahead and just flatten the heal clone layer into the background right now using the flatten button. I also really don't like this black rock that I couldn't keep out of my composition down here in the lower right corner. And that would have been difficult to remove well in Lightroom. So I'm going to do it here. I'll grab the lasso tool and I'll draw around it. And then I'll go ahead and do Content Aware Fill by clicking the CAF or Content Aware Fill button in the combo module. And that did a pretty good job of removing that. There's a little bit of cleanup that I could still do. But I'm going to make sure that I'm going to output to the current layer because I don't want any of that back, and say OK. And I can deselect. So did a good job removing that. Actually, this thing right on the edge of my my composition here also isn't very pleasant for me. So I'm going to go ahead and do a content aware fill on that. And also pretty good job, a little bit of cleanup that needs to be done. And I can deselect, and now I can come back with the spot healing brush tool and just clean up any little artifacts that don't look how I want them to look in here. Maybe right there and there. And I could zoom into 100% if I really wanted to view that up close and make sure it looks good. For the most part, I think that actually looks all right. Okay. Once I feel the image perspective and cleanup is finished, then I'm ready to begin developing. Tony and I both guide our image adjustments by asking ourselves this question: what do I think the image needs now? The first thing I think the image needs, or that I can see that it needs in my perspective, is that I need to do some separate adjustments to the sky and the land to balance the lighting between the two. And to do that, there isn't going to really be a luminosity selection or any other type of mask selection that's going to perfectly separate the two. So I'm just going to create a regular old school selection using the quick selection tool. And because the skyline is fairly obvious, the quick selection tool is able to do a pretty good, easy selection of that. Then I'll go into the Select and Mask workspace and refine that selection. I'll zoom in to 100%, Control-Alt-0 or Command-Option-0 on your keyboard. And then I can look along those edges and see that for the most part, yeah, that selection's already pretty darn good. But there are a few little places where it's not perfect. And I think if I just set a pixel radius on the edge detection of about 2 pixels, it'll probably find those little areas, and it did. Also, there's this area in here that doesn't have a defined place where the skyline and the sky meet. I know I don't want my selection edge to be back here in those back hills because those need to be in the same exposure value with the sky because they're so distant. I can use the mask tool here to, kind of paint down if I feel like I want this edge to come in here further, but I'm not sure exactly where. Maybe I'll just kind of paint it along there. And then I can always work with that part of the edge in my mask later on. So at this point, I'm going to output this to a selection. And now I want to save that selection in the Channels panel so that I can utilize it in the future. So I'd click the red Save button, and I'll just call it my Sky selection. And while that sky selection is still active, I'm going to go ahead and add it to a curves adjustment layer. And so now this curves adjustment layer will be targeted to the sky by that mask. And I can use the curve, pull it down, and darken the sky. So already that feels in better balance to me. Then I'll reload that same mask, which I can Control or Command click just on the mask, or I can Control or Command click on the channel. They'll both load the same selection. And now I want to take the inverse of that selection to make it a land selection. So I can click the inverse red button right here. And then I will make a curves adjustment layer, and it has that land mask attached. And now I can slightly lighten the land with the curve. Maybe somewhere in there. And already I feel like I'm getting a better balance in the light in the land and the sky. I do want to take a look at where I had that area that I wasn't sure what the exact boundary should be. And so now here in the mask, I can feather this out with a brush. So I'm going to go on this first mask, which is actually not quite as visible. Let's go to this layer. That layer is creating most of the issue. So I'm going to go to that mask first, and I'm going to paint with black to kind of feather that up a bit. So I'll pick a black brush, and I'll set it to 100% flow, but a low opacity. Maybe just like 10 or so percent opacity, and size my brush. And now I'm just going to feather across there on the mask and help that blend in much better. Okay, so I think now I've got it set. Yeah, so that's not creating an edge issue. And there's a little bit of an edge issue on this guy, so I'll go ahead and go to this mask, and in this case I will select still the black brush, and I'll just feather that mask down into this area a little more. And now that whole transition should look much more natural, and it does. Okay, what do I think the image needs now? Well, now I would like to darken this corner of the sky a little bit because of my polarizer. I've got some polarization here where the center is darker than the edge, and that's not really looking great for me. So I think I'll maybe try to do that with a hue and saturation adjustment targeted to those tones. So the first thing I want to do is look for a mask that's going to maybe target that right. So let's check out a blue channel, and actually that looks pretty good. But I do want to mask it just to this area of the image up here. So I could use the rapid mask feature to modify it. I'll start by clicking a lasso tool and drawing around the area where I want that adjustment to go. And then I click the rapid mask modification button, and now it creates a mask that'll just target that corner of the image. And now I can come down to the layer output and select a hue and saturation adjustment layer. And then I'm going to bring down the brightness there and work with the saturation and maybe the hue a little bit to try to get this to match up better with the other parts of the sky. And maybe somewhere in there. And also, the way the mask is feathering right along this edge isn't quite enough, so I'm going to take a black brush at a low opacity, maybe 20%, and just feather this side of that adjustment in just a little bit more to make sure it's nice and natural. What I think the image needs next is now to slightly lighten the blue sky in the middle. So I'm going to stay with that same blue source, I think, but I'm also going to use the pick tool to try to pick that tone right in the middle and see if we can find a zone mask that will really exactly get at what I'm going for. And in this case, it's getting the clouds too. Let me check the zones on either side and see if there's another zone that will better target just that area of blue sky. Actually, the zone 4, if I maybe work with it a bit, will do a good job. I think we'll try that. In this case, I'm just going to try dodging it or luminosity painting it to lighten it. So I'm going to go ahead and load that mask as a selection, and then I'm going to create a dodge layer. And then with the white brush, I'm going to paint through that selection at a very low opacity, maybe just less than 10%, and see if I can just very gently lighten that center area of blue sky. Let's see how that looks. Yeah, I'm over lightening the clouds just a little more than I want to. So I can pick the gray brush tool and bring up the opacity and use that to just kind of erase that out of the edge of the clouds here and here. Now let's see how that's looking. Yeah, There we go. That feels better. And I can even work with the opacity of that layer to get just the feel that feels right. And now deselect that luminosity painting selection I've got active and ask myself, what do I think the image needs now? I like how dark the rock is on this side because the sun is coming up right behind it, so that feels right. But some of these shadows in these rocks are a little too dark and lacking of detail. So I want to create an adjustment to lighten the shadows a little bit and bring out a little bit of detail. So for that, I need a mask that will target those shadows, and probably from the red channel because those rocks look pretty red. But let me also check out the yellow channel. And remember that those CMYK channels are inverses. So let me check out the darks here. No, the yellow's definitely not doing it. Let me go back to the red and the darks. And I think maybe a darks 3, if I modify it to open up those deepest shadows even a little bit more, maybe even with the midtone slider a little bit, somewhere in there. I also know that I only want this to affect the rocks on the left side, so I can further modify it with a black brush. And I'll set the opacity to about 50% for that brush, and then just use that to paint out that adjustment. Actually, I'm going to go up to, I'll go full 100%. I really don't want that adjustment over here at all. And so I'm going to paint it out everywhere I don't want it in the mask. So just another way to modify this mask. Okay, now I'll add that mask to a brightness contrast adjustment layer and use that layer with that mask controlling it to bring up the brightness of those shadows and maintain contrast in those shadows and find what's the right amount there. And sometimes I'll overdo it at this stage and then use the opacity of the layer itself to get just the right amount. Now the other thing is I want to also add some clarity into those same shadows. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and run the clarity action, and I'm going to zoom in to look at that area of the image up close. I'll come back here and find the right amount of clarity. And since it's in the shadows, I can use probably a bigger clarity radius to try to get into some of those shadow details. And click OK. And zoom back out. But now I don't want that clarity applied to the whole image. I just want it applied to those same shadows that I targeted in this mask. So I can hold down the Alt or the Option key and then drag that mask up to this layer, and that will copy it and let it control that layer as well. So now that clarity is only happening in those deepest shadows, and I can work with the opacity of the layer to get just how much I want. Next, I feel like the overall highlights across the image are a little bright, or I don't know, they need some additional work. So I'm just going to load a composite luminosity mask, and that's just the lights one. And I think that's working pretty good for me. I'm just going to go ahead and add that to a curves adjustment layer, and then darken the whole image, and maybe work with the curve to maintain some contrast, but just do that across the image to do some more highlight control. Now it's a little stronger in some areas than I would like, but the mask is generally doing a good job controlling that. I can click the X button to see what that adjustment would look like if I didn't have that mask. So you can see that luminosity mask is doing a good job of protecting the shadows, but now I want to mask the mask because I want to bring it in locally and kind of variably, but I don't want to lose the characteristics of that luminosity mask. So I'm going to add this to a group with a black mask by clicking the left side of the group button. So now it's in this group with a black mask, and that's concealing the adjustment. And now I can paint with a white brush on that black mask, And here I'm going to use 100% opacity and a low flow, maybe 10 to 12%, something like that. So now I can just kind of brush that highlight adjustment in around the image and just kind of create the highlight control that I want in the areas I want, the amount that I want it. All right, let's see how that's looking. Yeah, that's feeling like it's getting some really nice balance throughout the image. And I think you can see that in this way, by continually asking yourself, what do I think the image needs next, you can keep working on things incrementally, one small thing at a time. And how do you know when you're done? Well, when you get to a place where when you say, what do I think the image needs next, there really isn't anything. Now, I'm definitely not completely done with this image at this point, but we're well over 20 minutes into this chapter and I could really go on for hours. But I am going to do one final set of adjustments to this image just to kind of put the finishing touches on it for right now. And that is to add a bit of vignetting to darken the edges and contain your eye, and also some spotlighting to help draw the viewer right into the center of the image. So that's easy to do. I just grab the lasso tool and I draw my vignette where I want it to be in the edges of this image. Maybe something like that. And then I run the freehand vignette action. And that's a little more feathering than I want, so I'm going to bring the feathering down a bit. Yeah, that looks better. And then I can work with the opacity of the freehand vignette layer if I want to maybe darken it even a little more. And now I'm going to work with the spotlight, and I want to try to draw people into the center of this image, maybe here, and also maybe back into the rocks in this water back here a bit, and maybe even right onto this rock a little bit. Something like that. All right, so now I'll run the spotlight action. And the feathering for that feels good, but I can work with the overall brightness of the spotlight, and I can also open up the curves layer adjustment and further work with the contrast in the spotlight. Maybe something like that. And then I might select both of these layers and just add them into a group so I can control them all together at the same time. And I might call this, sometimes I'll call this dimension, because it helps create dimension in the image. And if I was being careful about all my developing, I would name all of my groups that I'd made so I would remember what they do later on. Okay, but let's say for now that we've gotten to the end of what I'm going to do with the image so far. So I'm going to hold down the Alt or the Option key and click on the eye of the background layer so we can see this is how the image came out of Lightroom. And this is how the image looks now after addressing a lot of those different things that I felt that the image needed. Now it would be time to save my master file with all the layers intact so I could come back and work on it again in the future. And if I felt like I wanted to share this image at this point with someone, maybe through email or on the internet or on my website, then I could come down here and say, okay, I want to web sharpen this to be 1500 pixels wide, and I'll go ahead and click the horizontal button. Oh, I do want to play the action to put my watermark on it. Everything else looks okay. So go ahead and size that to 1500 pixels wide. And there is the final sized and sharpened web image ready to share. Now I just click the green save button, save it, and I'm done. So to wrap up here, let me just say thanks for joining me on what's been a monster tour of the TK7 panel. I hope this video guide will help you make the most use of the panel so it can make your photography more efficient and more fun, and also help your images reach their full potential.